connecting to cloud server. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. This session is planning for next generation 911 in Canada, and we're going to be focusing on a case study of the Niagara region's journey to next generation 911. So in our session today, we're going to talk a little bit about what PSAPs in Canada should be considering for migrating their operation to next generation 911. We're going to then dig into an actual implementation or migration that's in process in the Niagara region. And we have a panel of people that are going to help us do this presentation today. And the whole intent of this is to give you PSAPs a better idea of what's involved in that migration to next generation 911. So with that, I'm going to move to the introductions slide here, and I'll go first. My name is Eric Perry. I'm a senior consultant with Federal Engineering. I've got a lot of years of service in public safety communications. Some of you may know me from my involvement with NENA. I have been involved in 911 implementations way back when 911 was just first being introduced. And I guess my background primarily right now today is involved in next generation 911 projects. So that's a little bit about me. Fadi, if you could go next, please, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. My name is Fadi Deblees. Formerly, I was the director of 911 at Bell, overseeing day-to-day operations as well as the introduction of next generation 911. I'm a proud ENP, or emergency number professional, from NENA. I'm also the Canadian director on the NENA Institute board.
Thanks, Fadi. And Cindy, would you go next, please? Tell us a little bit about yourself. And Cindy, you're our PSAP person. So people are going to be very interested in what you have to say from this whole perspective of the trepidation that's involved with the migration to next generation. So if you could just talk a little bit about yourself and your background, that'd be great.
Absolutely, thanks. So I'm Cindy Sparrow, and for those of you who don't know me, I have over 25 years in the public safety communications industry and the public safety industry at large. I've had the pleasure and privilege of working in centers all over Alberta, and also in leading centers in Southern Alberta and Lethbridge for police, fire, and EMS communication, as most recently in Red Deer for Red Deer Emergency Services, where I was the deputy chief in charge of the communication center and fire prevention, as well as IT. And so I have a varied career over the last 25 plus years in the industry, and that really helps me focus on all of integrated pieces and how they come together for PSAP. So understanding really well the people side of things, the process side, as well as the technology, and helping centers move through that change and implementation, particularly in regards to this presentation today through the next Gen 911 journey. And it's been my privilege to work with our team with FE as well as the Niagara region. So it's a little bit about me.
Thanks, Cindy. And I would say at this point that Fadi and Cindy were heavily involved in the needs assessment. That would be the digging into the, into the next layer of the onion as to what's going on in the PSAPs and with regard to the technology in the region. And with that, I will, that's a great segue into the next person that I'd like to have introduce themselves, and that's Akram, who's the Director of Technology in Niagara Regional Police Service. Akram, if you could go ahead, please.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the Director for Technology Services with Niagara Regional Police. I have been with Niagara Regional Police for the past 13.5 years, and I have overall accountability of the technology services within the agency, supporting also the technologies in the car, MDTs, radios, and we also provide the technical support for the PSAP. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Akram. Richard, could you go next, please? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon. Richard Frayne. I'm with Niagara Regional Police. I'm a superintendent here. I've been here for only 35 years soon. So obviously a police officer, my experience has been on sort of the receiving end of the communications once it comes through and gets processed. And ultimately I ended up in our communications unit as an inspector and then superintendent in charge of the area. So I spent probably close to 12 years connected to communications in a supervisory role. So I'm the one that kind of doesn't have a whole pile of understanding of what's inside the onion. I just know that there's a great big onion there, and rely on people like Akram and everybody else to tell me how the whole darn thing works. But I'm the one that really gets upset when the onion doesn't work. So that's kind of where I am at this.
Yeah, as Fadi uses a great analogy, it's the how is the sausage made? So, and Fadi, I'll let you, I can let you throw that analogy further on through the into this presentation. So what I'm going to do here now, just give you a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Fadi's going to talk about the regulatory aspect of next generation 911 in Canada, and what the CRTC has planned for us and is planning for us, and as well as the involvement of the Emergency Services Working Group. Then we're going to, I alluded to this in the introduction, we're going to hopefully tell you what you need to know should you decide to migrate to next generation 911. And we would strongly encourage you to pay close attention to that, because it's not a simple process. And then to kind of further go on that thought, we're going to dig into, actually present a case study, the Niagara region's journey to next generation 911. And I do believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Niagara is one of the first ones to really look at the migration from a regional perspective. So with that, Fadi, I'm going to ask you to kind of walk us through this diagram here, this timeline with regard to what the CRTC is doing with regard to the migration.
Thanks, Eric. So recognizing that some attendees will be well versed in NG911, it may also be new, or at the very least less familiar to others. So I'd like to take a moment to do a bit of a level set. We'll spend a couple of minutes discussing what is NG911, why is Canada and the rest of North America migrating to next generation 911, who's responsible for the NG911 migration, and when is the migration happening and how. So first off, what is NG911 and why are we changing? Well, the existing E911 network is over 20 years old and is fundamentally built on technology that's older than that. Now, the E911 networks that we have today are solid and resilient. However, they no longer support new devices, features that are available from carriers and device manufacturers. Now, NG911 in its end state is a network of networks. That is IP-based, following the NENA i3 standard, slightly modified for use in Canada. In the past, for text with 911 and wireless phase 2, we simply added on to the E911 network. NG911 is a complete replacement. This includes the network that carries the traffic, the equipment that PSAPs use to process the 911 calls, the procedures to support 911, training, operations, everything is new. However, in order to get there, industry is relying on the tried and true Canadian method of creativity, consultation, and consensus. Now, the CRTC is ultimately responsible for regulating the carriers and network technology used for next generation 911. To that end, the CRTC Interconnection Steering Committee, or CISC, has a sub-working group called the Emergency Services Working Group, also known as ESWG, or affectionately known as ESWG. ESWG takes emergency services mandates through a collaborative effort between PSAPs, 911 authorities, carriers, and other stakeholders. They develop reports, recommendations, which the CRTC then turns into rules and regulations. Now, it's important to note that while the CRTC governs the 911 service providers and the carriers, they do not regulate PSAPs or government authorities. However, the ESWG reports and CRT decisions do impact PSAPs and 911 authorities. So the way it works is the CRTC regulates the 911 providers. So here in Ontario, that's going to be Bell. The network providers enter into a 911 agreement with the 911 authority, depending where you are in Canada. That could be a city, a municipality, a township, a region, First Nations territory, or a provincial authority. Then it's up to the PSAP to implement those changes. So as you can see, it's an indirect form of regulation, but ultimately next generation 911 migration in any area is up to the government authority and their PSAPs. Now, as it relates to when these changes are happening, there are two key dates for you to consider. So we've got a timeline slide that shows you sort of the inception, the big telecom regulatory policy change that happened in 2017, leading right up to 2025. But there's two main dates that I think you need to concern yourself with now: March 2022 and March 2025. March 2022, the next generation 911 networks must be ready so that the PSAPs can start their NG911 migration. They don't have to start in March of 2022, but they can if they're ready. Now, the March 2025 date is when PSAPs must be off of the legacy E911 network that's in use today. So PSAPs and 911 authorities essentially have a 3-year window to migrate to NG911. During this window, PSAPs are free to test the new network, but Bell can't actually migrate your 911 traffic to the new system until the NG911 agreement is signed with the 911 authority. So just to give you an idea of what that means, there are a few hundred PSAPs across Canada to migrate. However, there are several thousand 911 authorities that have to sign those 911 agreements across Canada. So specifically, Bell can't start sending in Ontario live 911 calls to the network until that happens. So new features will be added to NG911 throughout the migration, as well as beyond 2025. So you see at the bottom, there's that arrow that leads us beyond 2025. We're looking at introduction of GIS mapping, real-time text to replace text with 911 and TTY, Z-axis, so the elevation of where you are, not just lat long or YX, but actually where you are in elevation, handset-based geo-routing, telematics, a slew of new features and capabilities that are to come with next generation 911. It's not all going to be there on day one. It will be iteratively introduced as we go on. So whether you've been working on this since 2017 when the CRTC established the new policy for Canada, or you're ramping up now, there is a great deal of work to do and many steps to complete. So hopefully this brief overview is provided with some context as to why things are changing and when. So the only thing left to do is everything. And to that end, our friends at Niagara have kindly agreed to share their journey to this point as well as the next steps.
Okay, but before we leave this slide, I want to ask you a very loaded question. It's probably something going through the minds of some of the PSAP folks that may be viewing this presentation. Is what if a PSAP opts out and decides that they don't want anything to do with next generation 911, they just want to remain status quo? What does that look like, Fadi?
Then they have to go to bed with no dessert. No, just kidding. What actually happens, so you don't have to go on to the next generation 911 network, but you can't stay on the existing E911 network. So what that means is that at your cost for each PSAP, you will have to implement a gateway. Essentially what that means is going to take the equipment that you have now, do some magic in the middle, make it talk to the new network. You will get none of the new features, none of the new advancements, no evolution to it. It is a dead end. So essentially, you'll have to pay for something that you've been getting for free for quite a long time, and you'll get no new benefit from it with no way of evolving that forward. So the absolute definition of a standard, a stranded or throwaway investment.
Okay, just a couple more things before we leave this slide. I just want to remind you viewers that there is a chat feature, and that if you have any questions that you would like to pose using the chat, it should be available to you, and we're going to keep an eye on that. And before we leave this slide, Fadi, I got to absolutely get this in. But how is Canada different than what's going on south of the border?
So we've got a much more consensus-based and consolidated approach. In the US, it's very much a state by state and even county by county in some states migration. In Canada, it's really being done, excuse me, at a national level. So the Emergency Services Working Group, as I mentioned before, is really undertaking a lot of the grunt work that has to be done. There's great information being provided and put out by there, but it's a very consolidated effort. We have this window. As far as I'm aware, in the US, there is no window of migration. There is no sunset dates. Some states have implemented that for themselves, but overall, I haven't seen anything from that from the FCC. So our commission has been very on the ball with this. They've been sort of leading the charge, supporting in the background as well, what needs to be done. So it's a all hands on deck kind of approach here in Canada, but much more a consolidated approach as opposed to just piecemeal state by state or region by region.
Yeah, it's very decentralized south of the border. All right, well, enough about the regulatory stuff. I'm going to ask Richard on this next slide to let's dig into the Niagara regional situation. And Richard, you can give us an overview of the agencies that are involved.
Yeah, it is complex when you start looking at this. And I think when I first started trying to understand NG911 and 911 itself, I didn't really understand how many agencies are actually involved, but you do become familiar with it quickly. And you might think you're the only one in your area, but you're probably going to find out that there's other agencies that you're going to impact, because very few are like a standalone that does absolutely everything. So Niagara region here, we are the primary PSAP for the region. So we take all of the 911 calls. So that's a responsibility that we have taken on from our region. Our region is like every other municipality. They have the responsibility to provide 911 services, however they do it. And they contracted with us to take 911 calls. So our police department, we're, I think, around 1,100 members now. So we're a fair size, but we take every 911 call that comes in. So that equates to about 180,000 911 calls a year that we handle. And as the police agency, we primarily keep the majority of this call. So it's around 63% that we keep and we process. But the other ones, we farm them out. So they either go to the fire services or to Niagara EMS. Niagara EMS takes about 30% of the calls, and then the rest go off to the other fire services. So we've got St. Catharines Fire Department that has a secondary PSAP. So we transfer the 911 calls to them. And Niagara Falls Fire, the same thing, we transfer calls to them. And then the Niagara Parks Police. Niagara Parks Police are pretty much married to us, so there's not a lot of difference with them. They're on our same CAD system and everything else. With the fire services, it does become a little bit complex because there are, so we're a large municipality. We have 12, we've got the region, and then we have 12 municipalities that we deal with. So that's 12 CAOs and 12 fire chiefs. You know, I was going to make a joke here about if you've ever seen the movie, The 12 Angry Men, but that's who we deal with. But it works pretty well, but it is very, very complex. And tied into that too, we have a municipality that is not dispatched by any of the fire services here. So St. Catharines Fire is not dispatching them, or Niagara Falls isn't dispatching them. They actually route out to Tillsonburg and then get the calls sent back to them. So that adds complexity to it. So it's a really complex situation that we have trying to deal with it. And like I said, initially when I started thinking about 911, I thought it's just, 911 call comes in and that's it. But then there's all these branches. So we've got all different CAD systems that we use. Some people, agencies are accredited. Niagara EMS is accredited. We are accredited. Fire services, not so much. Different radio systems. A lot of us have the P25 radio system. Other fire services don't have that. So there's a lot of moving parts to all of this. And then, as we'll talk about a little bit later on, some sort of consolidations that start to happen once people understand the actual costs of all of this. And Fadi was talking about that. You're going to be paying for something and not getting the benefit of it. And having to have those gateways can be very expensive. Or how do you get together and have it all make sense all on one platform?
All right, well, thanks, Richard. And I remind people of the chat. I want to thank Roberta Fox for posting the link to the ESWIG page, I guess, and the URL for that, if anybody's curious to go check that out. And I just want to say, these guys are living the dream, if I can use that analogy. They have a wealth of knowledge about what it takes to do this. And as you can see from this slide, they got their work cut out for them. in terms of bringing all these agencies together and trying to figure out the best way to do this whole thing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Akram. Akram, if you could start digging into the weeds a little bit on some of the GIS component. And before you start, I'll just say that whether we like it or not, or whether we understand it or not, GIS is going to be and is a huge component and a very important part of the migration to next generation 911. So Akram, if you could take that away, please.
No, thank you, Eric. Yeah, so I think based on the past couple of years and really trying to understand what NG911 really meant, GIS always came at the forefront, and it was very clear that the GIS data is really mission critical to the success of NG911. And when you're taking a look at your coordinates that are going to be really used to determine the PSAP that is going to be receiving the call and how you route that call 911. Today, we do that with E911, and a lot of us do a pretty good job on that. But now NG911 begins to really rely on other processes and coordinates to properly distribute that accurately to the PSAP that you're trying to downstream to or trying to dispatch. Definitely the content, the currency, which really means about the frequency of the updates that have to actually come in. And based on the information we have, if they were talking about 72 hours when a change has to happen, it has to come in, has to be vetted. You got to do the proper quality assurance on it, and then upload it into your CAD and into your mapping systems. The content, the accuracy of the data, becomes a lot more relevant right now. There are really a couple of standards, and the standard of STA 006, and then it's been updated as of January 2020, and that really is a NENA standard for 911. So now we got to really take a look at that and understand it, and understand what does it really mean into your PSAP, and how you can technically support it as well. There's also the TIF 92. It has been recently revised as of August 31st, 2021. That provides a lot of guidance and information with respect to GIS and how you can prepare your GIS platform to talk and integrate in a seamless manner with your CAD system. And also how that would be tied into your next generation 911 solution when you look at your account handling software, your telephone system. We have a great relationship with the region. The region have taken the lead in taking a look at the 911 data. They vet it, they coordinate it with the 12 municipalities, and then they prepare the file on a monthly basis and send it to the 911 service provisioning center. And once it's been vetted and passed all the validations, it just gets distributed to the PSAP. And we do our own vetting, and with each agency, we have to prepare it to now talk to our CADs. So when you look at it from a strategic perspective, you really need to deal with 2, 3, 4 different CADs. So that creates a lot of resource challenges, technical challenges, and so forth. But my advice, and I encourage everybody, is do not undermine the mission critical need for the GIS into your 911 system. So those are my comments, Eric, on that.
All right, well, I'll just for the people from the PSAP perspective that might be starting to glaze over a little bit. What the big change, from the PSAP perspective, is that the routing of 911 calls will be based on the location of the device, and that's called location-based routing. Today, we rely on the cell phone, the cell providers to provide, how to enable how those calls are routed. So we have a lot of misroutes is where I'm going with this. And with misroutes comes a bunch of transfers. So with the migration to next generation 911, the device the location that the device is reporting. And Fadi alluded to this. We don't have X and Y. We also have Z capability now. So if you're in a high rise, in theory, we should have a much better idea where our callers are actually located. So that's just one element of the importance of GIS and how it can work to make your life easier. So, and I think Cindy's going to talk a little bit about the transition from the PSAP perspective. So with that, let's jump over to this next slide here. And Akram and Richard, if you could kind of tag team on this one and talk a little bit about the risks and challenges that you guys have encountered.
Sure, I'll get us started a bit here, and then Akram can kind of jump in. So when we first started, and we've got a little slide later on that talks about the timelines that we went through. We became aware in 2017 that we really needed to get moving on NG911, and we're the primary PSAP. So how are we going to do that? The struggle for us at that point in time was we have all these secondaries that we were dealing with, all who are funded differently than we are, all who have a different understanding of the critical nature of this. A lot of people weren't even really aware that this was something that was really going to affect them. They just thought that it was just going to be an easy transition and they'd be able to go. But as we heard, there's a lot to it, and you got the risk of the gateways that could come into play. So really what happened with us was an understanding, having to develop an understanding of critically whose responsibility is this. We tried to drive it as the primary PSAP, which was under the contract with the region to get everybody on board to do all of this. It's not an easy task. Like I said, there's all these other dynamics that are going on with other agencies trying to figure themselves out. Do they want to be on the P25 radio system? What CAD system do they want? Are they going to be accredited? Do they even want NG911? We're not going to use it. We're hearing from some of them. So all of these problems came up. So we kind of got to a point, we went through a sort of a number, I'd say, of false starts where we tried to drive it. And then we said, well, we're just going to do it ourselves, and they can figure themselves out if that's what it's going to take. At which point, that's when the sort of the political buy-in came and the decision to move forward. So we really had to work with our region to bring everybody together and to explain to them, what the requirements were going to be. That this wasn't something that's a nice to do thing or an option to do. It's something that's going to happen to you, and you need to be technologically prepared for it. You need to have a budget prepared for it, and you've got to make certain commitments and decisions as an organization. So we'll talk about the steering committee that we formed up, but that was really bringing all the leaders together and figuring out, who's going to exist in the future as PSAPs, and getting that political buy-in to move forward, to have a united group on it. So that really was the will to do it and the decision to move forward, which ultimately leads to the RFP creation, which Akram can talk about now.
Yeah, and if I may just take about a minute or two. So I want to take you back to 2011, because it's important for you to kind of understand the complexity of the process. Back in 2011, Regional Council has asked all the PSAP agencies to kind of get together and take a look at the concept of consolidation. And it didn't mean that you had to consolidate your PSAPs, but there were other factors, not just in dispatch. And that process, there was a steering committee that was formed back in 2011 that included EMS, 2 fire chiefs, and Niagara Regional Police, and it took a look at CAD, took a look at radio systems, took a look at the PSAP itself. And there was a recommendation at the end of it, and that took about 3 years. And the reason I'm mentioning the time is this is going to take years before you actually be in a position where you successfully implemented the technology, talked about the operations, train your people, and so forth. In 2014, there was a recommendation to remain in a cooperative model, but take a look at synergies and areas where a collaborative approach could work. And one of the things that we looked at as a region is a ready system. So Niagara Regional Police in 2014 RFP'd for a P25 system that covered the region, and we ensured that our fire services can be onboarded when they're ready. And that was at the price of $17-18 million. Building in those synergies, we had 6 fire services, as Richard alluded earlier, who are now in our radio system. So going back to 2017 and 2018, we began to prepare for funding. And we went to the board in 2 years where we created the funding where we felt comfortable as a Niagara Regional Police that we're able to meet the mandate and be ready for the deadlines. Now, I know COVID hit and it caused 2 extensions into the mandate, which were helpful to buy us a bit of time. We brought in the fire services and the 2 primary PSAPs and fire and the Niagara Parks Police. And we said, okay, so what do we do now? And we hear loud and clear that funding is a challenge. And again, as Richard alluded, now you're talking to 12 municipalities. And then each PSAP took a look at their skill resources. And it became very clear that that's going to be a challenge for the other 2 PSAPs. So we asked the question is, well, what happens if one PSAP is not ready? So how do you pass that data that is important to the receiving PSAP and for them to dispatch their first responders? So here we are. We started the process in 2018, 2019, and I think in January 10th, we had a meeting and COVID set us back. And October 7th, 2020, that's when the project actually got created. Move forward to September 21st, 2021. That's when we began to develop the RFP. And we got together as a steering committee, which included the Niagara Police, the 2 fire services, EMS, and with the region being the lead. And we issued an RFP, I believe, in December of 2020 and closed in January, sometime I think the first week or second week, Eric and Richard, I think when we closed the RFP. And I think the work began in April of 2021, where there was an extensive data collection happening at all the PSAPs within Niagara. And that looked at CAD, looked at radio systems, looked at GIS, looked at RMSs, and I hope I'm not missing anything, and also looked at the staffing and the number of calls within each PSAP. And I believe, and the RFP looked at really 5 phases. Really the collection of the initial interviews, the data collections, preparing an initial draft report. Then the second phase was really looking at further data mining, and then coming back. And I think we expect a final report, Eric, in October, I believe, that is going to be prepared to go to regional council and the boards or the city councils to say where we're at. I believe we're planning to issue an RFP. Well, let me take a step back. We were looking at a procurement model. And one of the options we've talked about, just to be transparent, do we sole source? Do we piggyback off another PSAP? Do we issue an RFP, RFI, or do we know what we want and do we issue an RFQ? So those are the things that we're going through right now as a committee to determine what is the next appropriate step. And I believe we may be leading to a formal procurement process and saying, here's what is mandatory. Here's what we need. Here's what it's nice to have. It's not critical to be able to operate successfully in NG911. And hopefully we're looking to award, and again, we're just sharing some visionary timelines.
Sure.
to award by Q2, Q3 of next year. What is a critical piece, and I think it's important that we share that, is a PSAP has to figure out how do you transition from your primary to build your NG911 infrastructure, do your training, and be able to cut over to your backup site if you have one. And you gotta determine does the backup site have enough space? Because you're replacing a lot of the equipment. You're no longer gonna have a telephone set. So now we're going to have software. You're going to have computers is running your call, and it's going to be integrated. Is your CAD ready? Fadi brought up a good point. Is if you're not ready to cut over in March 4th, 2025, then you're going to have that gateway. Well, an important question that each PSF has to ask is when you're receiving an NG911 on the primary, there's something now, NENA is a NENA standard called an emergency incident data object. And that information has a lot of incident information that is not available today in the current E911, but may become available as an NG911 call. Well, does that matter from a safety of the first responder? So those are the questions and the operational questions that a PSF should ask itself. So realizing the challenges with that, we get together as a region, and we said we need to look at this as a regional approach, not a police approach or a fire approach. And for example, some information that may be coming in is you get the call information, you get the additional information about the caller that you may not have today. You get the caller location, the agency, the vehicle, the person, the incident. This has to be in CAD. So it's a long journey. This is going to take a couple of years, and I know we have it in future slides, but do not underestimate what is involved. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail in a couple of more slides on that.
Sure. So one of the things that's going through my mind, and Fadi, you having a great deal of experience in Bell, if a PSAP is thinking of doing this or realizes that they need to do this, the sooner the better. Would that be a fair statement? That the telco simply won't be able to accommodate a whole bunch of PSAPs trying to do this at the last minute. So it's very important. I think that message has to be out there as well, is that this stuff doesn't happen overnight, as you've heard Akram and Richard describe the process. It's complicated and it takes time. But with that, we're going to move, in the interest of time, we're going to move to the next slide here. And we have a question that's couldn't be better timed if we're still kind of circling around on GIS. The question here from Glenn Hadley is, how do 911 authorities prepare their GIS data? What is involved in this process? So Akram, can you tackle that one?
Sure. One of the, I can give you an advice that I think is working for us. When we did our initial data discovery with the assistance of federal engineering, having your regional folks involved with ESWIG and looking at the standard and validating their data and preparing it for NG911, because you can only do what you know today, and things are going to change. That's how we begin to prepare for that. You may have to lean on a consultant, and some regions within the Golden Horseshoe have relied on consultants. If you're an Azure shop, Azure could help you out. But I think you got to take a look at your data and how they're going to kind of look at your data management. You have to look at the new standards and how do they fit in within your GIS infrastructure and layers. How accurate is? Do you trust it? Does it meet the 95% or 90% accuracy rate? The PERS 911 is a great starting point. If you kind of look at what do you have today, you got to take a look at the procedures. You got to look at the specifications. So if you don't have the resources, and in your region, and the region is a great resource. We are lucky that we have very good, competent, technically savvy regional GIS staff. You got to take a look at what happens when it comes into your PSAP. Who owns it? Who's going to run that? Do you now look at a shared service? Do you have to hire more people? So this is the journey that we're going in there, and based on the information we have today, is we can say with confidence, based on the information we have today and based on the information we got from the region, and it's been validated by federal engineering, that we're ready for now NG911 based on what we have today. If you're not, we encourage you to talk to neighboring PSAPs, talk to other municipalities and see what they've done. you could be able to borrow some of the best practices that they've done and to prepare your GIS data and how does it talk to your CAD. And that's really, just the kind of, for the spectrum of the time. It could be good, it could be a full overhaul, and that's just GIS, right? There's the ASWIG or the TIF 91 is a very good document. The NENA standard is an excellent document to tell you what is mandated and what is required. Consult that. That becomes your Bible to give you a starting point.
Right. Well, thanks, Akram. And I would have to say of all the projects that the FE team has been involved with, we haven't found the level of expertise and organization anywhere than what we found in Niagara. Your regional GIS people are right on the money with that. So, all right. So we're going to move now to the next slide here. And again, Akram kind of touched on some of these already, but I'd like Richard just to kind of just walk us through here briefly. And the takeaway from this is kind of what I said a few minutes ago, is that this thing takes time. And these are kind of what the milestones that the Niagara project looks like.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, we didn't really put in here really when this whole thing really started. We can go right back to that even, which Akram kind of talked about. It was the concept of the report that we had from another group in 2012, where it talked about the need to find best practices amongst each other with all these different PSAPs and work towards a potential consolidated model. So that kind of got things going, and it's kind of percolated now, for that period of time. And then in 2017, the CRTC decision came out, which caused us to get together in January 2018 and start talking about the project. What do we need to do? Well, as you can see, there's a year gap in there. So it takes us a year to even start to get budgets approved for things like that and to have an understanding. And at that point, it was just kind of a stab in the dark on what this was going to cost. And then once you start really thinking about things, that's when you get into developing things. So right after, or right before the fourth quarter of 2020, we know we're all into COVID-19, which, it's been a pain for sure, but it did give us a little bit of breathing room because some of the goalposts kind of got moved for us as a result. So that was good, but we've been a long time putting everything together and getting everybody in to understand what the commitment's going to be, what the buy-in is going to be, how we establish our committees to look at this, what we want to look like in the end. It took us almost 2 years to get the steering committee established that brought everybody together, then so we know we're all on the same page. We still do have some dynamics going on because trying to figure out, at the end of the day, which of the fire services are still going to be standing as PSAPs. That's really not their number one driver. They want to fight fires. That's what the fire chief wants to do. And this whole dispatch thing kind of goes along with it. And how does that happen? So it took us a long time. Here, the last date you see here is that April 2021 is when we formally got the consultant to come in through an RFP process to help us. So it does take, you see 3.5 years worth of work right there. And things are, boiling now at this point in time. So it's no longer simmering, but we're at that point in time. And it does take a long, long time. And you've got to be very aware of all the budgets that you need to get approved, especially if there's other agencies involved, convincing them and having them plan to do that. So it takes a long time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Richard, for that. Speaking of consultants and consulting, we just wanted to put this up here to show you from the consultant's perspective how the project looked, what the milestones kind of looked like, very high level here, of course, and the duration and the start and the finish dates. And I think we've done a pretty good job meeting those dates. But what I want to do with this is call on Fadi and Cindy, because I think the needs assessment part of this whole thing, we haven't really talked much about that. And I'm sure some of you are wondering, how does that work? How do you do your needs assessment? Who do you talk to? And what are some of the things that you run into when you're doing this needs assessment? So, and I know Fadi has his propeller hat on, but he's talked enough. So I'm gonna, Cindy, if you could talk more about kind of the hands-on stuff. You were heavily involved in, the needs assessment from the operations perspective. So if you could just walk us through how that looked, what that looked like, and kind of what the results were from your efforts.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So as Richard alluded to earlier, this was a complex project because there are multiple stakeholders in the region that offer different kinds, have systems that are the same. It was really important from the very beginning that we had a good identification of all the stakeholders that were involved and then had a chance to speak to them directly. So through a combination of gathering data for each of the agencies, as well as meeting with them for interviews, really understanding their business from a technical and an operational sense, that helped us understand exactly what the current state was so that we could know all of the things that are going on for each of their centers independently, where there was some overlap, and then have a really good understanding of what their future vision could look like for when they transition into next gen 911. But of course, in the middle of that is the gap analysis. So to get them from here to here, what do we need to do in the meantime? And from the operational perspective, we focused on things like what are the regulatory and legislative impacts on them? What must we need to follow? What must we need to do? Looking at things like governance. This is going to be the first time they've ever implemented a next gen 911 solution, and they're doing it together. So we've got to figure out what's the governance looking like for that so that we are all working together in collaboration as we move forward. What does the funding model look like? How are we going to pay for this to upfront and in the long term? And as well as things such as staffing. What staffing requirements will we need? What kinds of training will we need? What is our quality assurance and quality improvement programs going to look like? And how will it support this kind of change? The other things I like to talk about too is, while this is really in the beginning stages of Next Gen 911, it's about the guts of the system that are being implemented and changed. There are some technologies that could change in the center because of that, such as your call handling system. That's going to be a change for people that we need to keep in mind. So we're going to have to look at the different kinds of things that they'll need in each of the centers to support that. The recording technology may have to change because it may not be Next Gen 1 compliant. Same thing with the CAD system. If CAD systems aren't ready for Next Gen 911, then we have to look at either how will that CAD vendor work with them, or what do we need to move to get them ready. I think that, one of the biggest things that we really focused on as well throughout this process that I cannot stress enough for centers across the nation is change management, because we know that change efforts often fail, like 70% of the time, if we don't move people along in the process. So really working to keep everybody really well informed and involved about what this is going to look like, the impacts that it's going to have on them, and how we help prepare them to move themselves through this change so that they're really well informed the whole way through and involved. So in a nutshell, I don't want to take up too much time because I know we're going to probably have time for Q&A. In a very high level overview, that's really how we worked with Niagara to make sure that we were supporting them the best way that we could, understanding what their current state was and figuring out how to get them to a successful and long-term Next Gen 911 implementation. So
Sandy, what kind of questions around the trepidation with regard to the migration did you run into? Were there, I know you talked to a lot of PSAP people, and I'm going to give Fadi a chance to talk about the blinky lights in a minute. But what were some of the concerns that were raised as we did that needs assessment?
Do you know that the number one question that was asked by all of the operations groups was, tell me about the video and how it comes into the center and what are we going to be exposed to? And so I'm really happy to share with everyone, if you don't know already, that that's not going to be in the initial stages. Video is not going to be a part of the initial rollout of Next Gen 911, but also that there are working groups that are representing and advocating for centers so that that information doesn't just come across willy-nilly. Never will anybody ever be able to just send a video to a 911 center where there's, high exposure to graphic trauma that could be on the other end of the line. But there's going to be a system in place that allows us to decide when we pull that information into the center, and it'll be based on certain criteria, and it will be a national rollout, which is what I love about what Canada is doing so well. The national rollout, so that from coast to coast to coast, it's all the same. I think that was probably one of the biggest fears. is what's coming across that line now that we're going to have video text, and how is it going to impact us?
All right, that's great. Okay, Fadi, real quick. You know, we come from a culture where we want the blinky lights in the back room. Next generation 911 is going to change that. Could you talk a little bit about some of the things that you touched on when you did your portion of the needs assessment, like cybersecurity and all this stuff that's swirling around in the blender?
Absolutely. And I mean, in Canada, we are quite spoiled. We do get a lot of support from our 911 service provider. That isn't necessarily the case always that we've seen across the US. But in terms of, some of the interviews that we did and so on, we really wanted to hit it from all the different levels. So, we spoke to director of IT to get the planning and the vision for this. We spoke to the day-to-day operational folks that support this or use the system, as well as the IT people, sysadmins and so on that are actually maintaining some of this equipment. And a lot of the questions really came around, what do we have to support? What model would be most efficient, and so on and so forth. So lots of options were given in terms of how this could look like from a shared arrangement, hosted arrangement, all sorts of different, bringing data centers into it. So really looking at it from all the different levels, whether it be management, support, planning in committees. We wanted to really get the full vision in terms of the technology, what's there today, what the expectations are tomorrow, and what those choices are.
Thanks, Fadi. On this next slide here that you guys see up now, we've talked about a lot of this. So in the interest of time, I think that we're just going to jump to the next slide. We're kind of on the home stretch with this. And again, if you have any questions for the panel, please feel free to go ahead. And I think we've got about 10 minutes left, roughly. So Akram and Richard, if you could just highlight your strategic approach here and let us know how you kind of, your philosophical way of dealing with this project.
Yeah, I'll grab a few bullet points and then Akram can kind of jump in, and anybody else. So the big thing is to understand it's really happening, and it comes really, really quickly. So it's highlighted there, do not underestimate. This is going to happen sooner than you think. Start thinking about your funding for all of this. That can be a major impediment that you have to overcome if you don't have your funding in place. How are you going to afford this? Akram, if you want to talk about your GIS mapping again.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, consult the standards. I saw something in the chat where MESA and APCO also have an NG911 working committees. Take a look at your data, begin to validate it now. Make sure that it is ready to migrate to NG911 or to be supporting your CAD. And again, as we said, do not underestimate all the pieces. All of them are interrelated, all of them are interconnected, and they cannot be separated. You notice that our roadmap to 2024 is not a typo. Although it says March 4th, 2025, you need time to transition. Don't wait till March 5th to say, okay, now I'm cutting over. So you need time. Cybersecurity is critical. This is not a phone line. This is running over your network. So do you have the right resources? Are they trained to really manage NG911? We have expertise to manage security, but it brings a different level of security and all the pieces that have to come together for an NG911 solution. I'll talk about one: disaster recovery, business continuity. Do you have one for your PSAP? How are you going to transition? Are you going to cut over while you're in production doing that? Most likely not. So you need to evacuate the primary when you upgrade the backup. And when the backup is good, you got to upgrade the primary site and then cut back over. So you got to talk about those. You got to give them some thought. And Richard, then I'll turn it over to you for maybe on the last bullet.
Yeah, the big thing is being prepared to manage this change. I think Cindy talked about change management, and Akram's talked about it. This is a significant change that's going to happen. You're going to get people who are afraid of everything. So you need to be prepared on how you are going to manage all of this change. And as we can see, the change isn't just within your organization, it's probably going to be with other agencies. So, look at the people involved, figure out the technology, how we're going to deal with that, how we're going to get people trained, how we're going to get people to buy in, testing and integration, all your processes that change, how we're going to do that, the funding. And then kind of the last point that we've got there is the governance. So we have originally called this, the strategic governance slide, but it's really critical that you have the right people, decision makers that can help push this whole process forward and can make the decisions, because people will get locked into their own worlds and won't be able to make those decisions. But you need to have strong people pushing it and getting the right data to them so they understand the decisions they need to make, so you can have a proper governance committee and move it forward. So Eric, is there anything you wanted to add in there, or Fadi or Cindy?
I think we're good. We're almost out of time. I just got the dinger from the organizer of the presentation technology that we have just a few minutes left. So I think what we'll do here is we'll go to this last slide here. There are no pending questions in the chat, at least nothing I can see here. But what I want to just point out to you is we're the ones collectively making the sausage here. Fadi, I was waiting for that. You never, I threw you that bone, you never took it. But here's our contact information. And please feel free to reach out to us. You can email us. We're going to be providing, if any of you want a PDF of this presentation, just you can shoot us an email, shoot me an email at that eperry@fedeng.com. And I think the conference will have an archive of this presentation that you guys can go and watch or talk to your friends and neighbors about. And I think that's pretty much it.
It looks like we do have a question, Eric. Chris has told us that there's questions in the Q&A portion. I'm looking in the Q&A and one just popped in. There was just the one that we answered, but there's some in the chat section now, actually, if you wanted to just take a look.
Yeah, let's see what we got here. The question from Roberta is, have you identified the post-install technology and operational support changes required and additional staff roles added? Also, how to hire and train for new media, the new tech required for future call takers. Cindy, do you want to grab that one?
Sure, that's a whole other webinar, but I'm going to do my best to answer it in short order. So yes, we've actually, we have addressed the different kinds of staffing changes that will happen. Now, without knowing what we're implementing from this piece forward, we will be better able to define that once we've gone past the RFP process and we know exactly what we're implementing and what impacts it's going to have on staffing and training. And then also how to hire and train for new media and new tech required for future call takers. So we work with clients a lot on how to recruit and retain, how recruit and retention. It's by absolutely hiring the right fit person in the first place, and then making sure that absolutely that we're documenting through the process of implementation all of the training requirements and integrating that into the system. Again, what's most important through this process is a quality assurance and a quality improvement program that helps us, as we implement these changes, measure that we're actually having the success we're expecting, and then making changes along the way for identifying training, introducing training that can help with bridge those gaps for misunderstandings for how the technology might work for people.
Okay, and we got 2 minutes left. We got another question here, and Akram, this could be for you. Could you touch on any formalized agreements between?
Yeah, I can provide a very quick. So there's a formal agreement between the region and Niagara Regional Police, the fact that we're there contracted by them. I do not recall we have any MOUs from a dispatch to dispatch, but we have contingency plans, i.e. between us and St. Catharines Fire. So we talked about governance, and Cindy talked about it, and Risha talked about it. This is the opportunity to kind of have those understandings and agreements in place as we together go through that journey. But definitely between the region and Niagara Regional Police, there's a formal agreement.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone. We're running out of time here. We were allowed at 60 minutes. We've used it. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to the 60 some odd people that viewed the presentation. And if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to follow up via email to any one of us. And again, I want to thank the panelists on today's presentation, and hope that you got some questions answered. And it was our pleasure to give you this presentation. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
I think it's
That's it.
only us right. I think it's only us right now, right? So. No, I
Right.
think it went really well. Very
I think
good.
it went great. I think it went great. Thank you, guys. I think we touched on everything. I think one of the things we did a pretty good job of is kind of looking at this from the brain of the PSAP people. What do they need? What's the takeaway for them? What do they need to really figure out? And I think
Just
the
a heads
message.
up, I think we're still live. Yeah, I think there's still
are we?
attendees.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I
but
guess-
see you
it's still
guys.
great to it's still great to debrief afterward.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
As long as we don't use the F word, stuff like that.
we would never do that.
Okay, guys. See you later. Have a great
Hey,
afternoon.
I got another call
Okay.
I got to jump to. So thank
Okay,
you all.
take care, everyone. Thanks, everyone.